am Christopher Brennan, and I am the Chief Product Officer of Overtone, which uses artificial intelligence, natural language processing to differentiate between types of news article.
How come that that you are solving a problem of figuring out what are the articles about on the scale? And one could only wonder, like, don't they know what they're writing about?
What we did is essentially looked for the types of articles that they could look at, and these are editorial types, right? So they already have things like, is an athlete mentioned in this? Is this sort of sports or news, etc.? But if you look at the editorial type, then you can make decisions about where you want to put it. So essentially, we automate that process of being able to read something and know a little bit about it, so that if you are an audience engagement editor or a content strategist, you can say, okay, here is what we want to do with a certain type of piece, and here's what we don't want to do. Here's how we want to treat things differently. Content is also just a goldmine of insight about what that experience is for a reader.
Yeah, and I think it's talking about a publishing business, it's also, I think, very hard to produce content of a high quality, and at the same time trying to kind of figure out the best way to distribute it.
BotTalk podcast.
Christopher, thank you so much for joining in, for finding the time, and I'm very excited to talk about your product and especially about your background and how you came to be to. So yeah, tell us all about it, and maybe a quick elevator pitch.
Sure. So I am Christopher Brennan, and I am the Chief Product Officer of Overtone, which uses artificial intelligence, natural language processing to differentiate between types of news article by what's in them. So it's not quantitative, it's not clicks and shares, it's really looking at the text, looking at the textual signals and saying, this is a long form feature, this is a daily story, this is a quick update, etc. So that our customers, news publishers specifically, can use those articles in different ways, depending on what they are, to provide the best experience to their readers.
Yeah, sounds perfect. Sounds really interesting. Maybe we'll go back to a product in a minute, but maybe about yourself, about your background. I know it's a very interesting story for our listeners.
I've led a varied and interesting life so far. So I am Christopher. You can maybe tell by my accent that I'm American, though calling you now from Brussels, Belgium, and I can explain how I got there. From a place called St. Louis in the US. For those of you sort of maybe more European-based, that's in the middle of the country, in the Midwest, south of Chicago. And grew up there, but then moved to New York for university, and then from New York got into journalism, and began my career actually in Russia at a small English language paper called the Moscow Times, which was a very interesting time to be in Russia. And this was sort of 2012, 2013, 2014, the beginnings of things that are still playing out now. And then bounced around a bit, went to UK, New York for many years, was working for a New York paper when they sent me to Europe to be European correspondent for that newspaper. Which was another good gig. And I traveled all around Europe to sort of Italy for elections and the royal wedding in Britain and Poland and things like that. Though being based in Brussels for that post, I became very interested in what was going on in Brussels, specifically around tech regulation. This was during 2017 and 18. Things, data privacy, GDPR, Facebook algorithm change, Cambridge Analytica. So I became fascinated about the sort of data that exists for news, how news is treated by the big platforms that we all know, as well as how it could be treated. So became involved with a project around that for a while on newsletters. And then through that, eventually met my co-founder, Philip Allen, and then my other co-founder, Reagan Emily, joined after that. We said, hey, there's really a business here where you can use the technology, the NLP, that has sort of been galloping along for the last little while, and now really accessible for for solving real world problems, and use that technology to help the publishing industry specifically, and then use that insight from publishing to help other places as well.
Wow. Okay. Very fascinating story. A lot of like a deep background in journalism. Maybe just a quick question. As I've been to Brussels, I had this, feeling of, regulators talking about how they should regulate or restrict the big platforms. And basically what I'm thinking as an entrepreneur is, well, because big platforms are actually figured out their business better than the publishers themselves. So the big platforms figured out that, it's all about data. It's all about what your publishers are, what your users are, what they're doing. And yeah, maybe so this is maybe a question about the product straight away, is that how come that that you are solving a problem of figuring out what are the articles about on the scale, and one could only wonder, like, don't they know what they're writing about? Don't they know what the article is about?
So you do for an individual article, and of course the writer writing knows what they're writing about, hopefully at least. But newsrooms are bigger than that, and so what you have is you have articles. I sometimes have a love and hate relationship with the word content, but content is what we're talking about. The writer knows, and then it's used in different ways. So specifically, I think the main users of Overtone scores are audience engagement editors, people who are using the pieces that have been written by their colleagues and putting them out into the world, whether that's the homepage, whether that's a newsletter, whether that's social media posts, making decisions about sort of inside or outside of a paywall, including this in different channels. And so when you have a publisher, and these people can't read everything that is produced because there's only sort of a handful of these people in the newsroom charged with sharing the output to the world. So what we did is essentially looked for the types of articles that they could look at, and these are editorial types, right? So they already have things like, is an athlete mentioned in this? Is this sort of sports or news, et cetera? But if you look at the editorial type, then you can make decisions about where you want to put it. So essentially, we automate that process of being able to read something and know a little bit about it, so that if you are an audience engagement editor or a content strategist, you can say, okay, here is what we want to do with a certain type of piece, and here's what we don't want to do. Here's how we want to treat things differently. So it's interesting that you mentioned sort of big tech and news, and I think news is evolving to where they realize that they do need data to create experiences for people. There's this whole growth in newsrooms of the idea of news product, which wasn't really there even 5 years ago. But it's the idea that they're creating experiences for their readers, sort of the same way a tech platform would, basically. And that they need to have sort of the tech stack in order to be able to do that. And part of that is when you're dealing with editorial differences, you need distinctions editorially in order to make the best experiences for your readers.
Okay, when we're talking about experiences, this is something that, personally, I think is in focus right now with our product, with BotTalk, and lately on the strategy meeting, we just realized, wow, yeah, it is all about, user experience, and how awful actually the user experience for the normal, newspaper consumer right now is, right? So let's dig deeper. What is the problem? What is the problem with a current user experience on, what are you solving basically?
I mean, for us, I think one of the most interesting aspects for us is sort of personalization. And there's some outlets that are very focused on real personalization. This is user XYZ, and we want to sort of serve them with a certain sort of article or experience in order to get that for them. But even beyond that, I think that publishing previously had the newspaper or the outlet. And this was decided by the editors sitting in their big leather chairs, smoking their cigars, putting this out into the world and saying, this is what's important. This is A1, top of the page, this is lower here, etc. And that worked because newspapers were the source for information in a specific place. They had sort of this semi-monopoly on news in their city. And now there's obviously a lot more choice out there, but also a newspaper is just different things to different people. When you opened up a physical newspaper before, you could flip to the sports section if you wanted. You could flip to the anything section. And so now that newspapers are operating not just on that physical page, not even really on a website, but on all these different ways it is to touch people in their inbox, on their social media feed, etc., then you need to make sure that you still have that differentiation there. It's sort of you can't have one experience and just everyone acquiesces to that, because that's not the way the internet works. There's an element of choice and there's an element of personalization just sort of built in by the way that people navigate through the online world.
Yeah, sure. So my Instagram looks completely different than your experience when you open Instagram, and the same with Twitter. Everything is highly kind of algorithm driven and highly personalized in comparison to like a news but do you think that this is like a problem that those guys in publishing are unable to solve? What is your experience? And then now like a deep dive into your product. Where is like the pain, the real pain that you are solving for the publishers? So they cannot solve this highly technical, because I know we've been trying to build this suggestion algorithm for a while now, and we talked about it with you, I think, a couple of months ago, and we're still coming back to you about that because I mean it is like obscenely hard to do, even with the data that we have. I mean, so how do you solve it?
I mean, there's certain people in the publishing world who are building their tech teams out now and are going for things like that. Not so much on, I'll get to that in a second, but who are building out their teams to deal with optimizing algorithmic processes for what they have. I was interested, for instance, in WANIFRA, the big organization of editors, held a data science day in Paris, which was quite useful. And there was guys from The Guardian and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and all of these places talking about what they were doing. A lot of it's on churn, because that's, of course, sort of directly related to the business aims of a publisher, but also looking more at the content and thinking about recommendation and things like that. So they are working on it. But what the problem is to me is that the data isn't there for sort of all of the uses in the editorial use case. Editorial, because they are providing information to people. It's not just about getting someone to click. It's about sort of creating that experience. The data is just not there. There's that old saying of, when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail.
Yeah.
And when all you have is page views, everything is a way to get more page views. That's sort of that's one way to think about it. So if you want to create a more nuanced content strategy, it can't just be page views all the time or social media all the time, because we saw this in the publishing industry. I mean, I remember a lot of publishers had put a lot of their eggs in the basket of Facebook, and then Facebook sort of turned the power out on news, and that was detrimental to a lot of publishers' sites. We're talking sort of more than 10% of traffic sort of stuff. And so to me, the pain point of what we are solving for is providing that editorial data, providing that sort of specialized data for news that they can use to make their own products and build products on top of that. So we really are sort of an under layer of what they want to do, and I want them to go paint their masterpieces with our data.
Yeah, makes sense. So basically, the hypothesis is, okay, the big tech guys figured out the algorithm pretty much, and it's going to take like ages for publishers to figure out this tech part for themselves, and you are helping them to do so quicker, hopefully.
It's not just figuring out the algorithm, right? I mean, there's the algorithms of a Facebook or a Twitter or Google are optimized for their own uses.
Mm.
And you just need to have different inputs to receive the uses that publishers want. I always find fascinating, maybe we talked about this before, the difference between sort of a Facebook and a TikTok, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of a traditional Facebook way of using the social graph as the primary means of serving content versus TikTok, which guards its algorithm pretty closely, but most people assume is using more of the content itself to deliver that, deliver what you see on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I think is even sort of a step in an interesting direction for publishers, just because publishers, they have the content, and that's sort of their USB, if you want. Like they're the people who have that, and that's the value they bring to people. And that content is also just a gold mine of insight about what that experience is for a reader.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think it's talking about the like a publishing business. It's also, I think, very hard to produce like content of a high quality, and at the same time trying to kind of figure out the best way to distribute it to public. I think those are like completely different kind of ball games. And if you look at the like a big tech guys, they do not produce content at all. I mean, the people are producing content. They just figuring out how to present it. So that is very much fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, these two things are linked, right? I mean, when you talk about content moderation now with Twitter, et cetera, sort of the tech people need to figure out how to deal with the content they have as content. And the publishing people need to figure out with how to distribute the content they have as a distribution experience.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so who is your like a typical customer? Maybe let's dig deeper into like what size of a publisher. How do they find you, and what is like your typical sales process then?
Yeah. So one thing that we've found real sort of success with is larger publishers who have different sort of nodes in their systems. So one of our clients is the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is a big group of newspapers in the US, more than 400 of them. And the Institute for Nonprofit News is sort of an organizing body that sits on above them and helps them out. And so one thing that they were interested in is just seeing all of the pieces from all of their network, and being able to have eyes on that for things like newsletters. So you can do something just looking at all the environmental articles from all of INN, and you think, this one is sort of an in-depth one from California. That's may mean it's more interesting for people in the rest of the country, from Florida to New York, or whatever, or on specific topics like rural news, for example. It's interesting for thinking about that syndication use case of saying this is content that sort of fits the bill of what we want, so we can move it around our systems. So those larger publishers with sort of lots of diverse types of content tend to be where we have the most success. Of course, if you are only publishing 5 articles a day and they're all basically the same, it may not sort of serve you as well, but definitely being able to have eyes on what you're doing across a week or even into your back catalog is where we find the most success.
Okay, makes sense. And in terms like what is like an actual user experience of using the product? So is it some kind of stats that I get from your system, or how does it work?
Yeah, so we have different, again, in sort of fitting the needs of everyone. We have some people who just use the API, which is great, and then you can send us a URL or a body text of an article if that's in your system. We also love RSS feeds, and then we can get you back the scores and the confidence levels in that score tied to a certain URL or tied to a certain body. So then you can use that in your system, in your CMS, even in a spreadsheet, even like wherever you need that, just in your own.
And just a quick note: what is inside of the score? What are like parameters that you give?
So just the score. So the in-depth score is sort of our first model, and then we're looking forward to providing more fine-grained definition on this to really differentiate between sorts of articles. but the basic scale is about the sort of journalistic signals within it. So does it include interviews? Does it include certain sorts of sourcing? Is it just aggregating a tweet, or is it talking to an expert professor? Is it providing relevant data? Is it sort of digging into these things? There's nothing wrong. Just before we go on, there's nothing wrong with any sort of story. A short update about a sports score is a great journalistic story if that's what I want, if that's what belongs in this newsletter or belongs in this social media post. There's nothing wrong with any of these stories. They're just different. And so we have the original scale goes from sort of those quick little updates, or it's non-news, it's a recipe, it doesn't really have those journalistic signals. Up from that, you have the sort of the single source sort of articles. Maybe there's a car crash on the Autobahn outside of town, and there's one source and it's the police. In the middle is sort of those normal sort of bog standard journalism stories. Maybe someone goes to court about that car crash and gets a little bit of information there. Moving up the scale, you have people who are doing more interviews and getting data. Maybe car crashes are up 15% on this side of town, and here's a little explanation of it. And then at the high end, it's those enterprise pieces, what in journalism are called enterprise pieces, that may take weeks or months to do. Maybe they talk to everyone around a certain intersection on part of town to realize how this intersection, the lack of a traffic light, is ruining their lives. So those are sort of, that is our scale now, with the different sort of signals, journalistic signals that you have in it. And then looking forward to providing more definition soon on whether this is sort of an opinionated analysis or an in-depth feature or an explainer and things like that.
And then basically, you get this score, and then it's my job kind of, how I handle it. I can save it on in a database, or, somehow connect to my CMS and whatnot. Okay, I got it.
And then for some people who don't really have a CMS or want to integrate us into a CMS right away, then we also offer just sort of a visual interface where you can look through your articles, and we'll sort through it for you and show you what you want to see in different feeds.
And on the basic level, that's a model that you trained, right? Based on like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of articles. And should I understand it like it's an English first model, or can you model be like my?
So one thing that we're kind of super keen on is we don't want to impose English on other languages. So all of the text in the English model is English native text. It's from all over the world. The other thing we didn't want to do is have it a model that only liked people from New York or people from London or something like that. So sort of English as a global language. We received a grant earlier this year from the NYC Media Lab to move the model into Spanish, which was successful in building a proof of concept there. So we generalized that. Spanish is a tough cookie also, because there's European Spanish and Latin American Spanish and all of that. And our model has 21 countries worth of Spanish language in it. But that's something we're planning for future models as well, is to have native language content in each model, because there's also differences between journalism in English versus in Spanish or in French or in German, etc. Though now that we've built the Spanish model, we know sort of how to do it, and we expect that to be able to do new languages quickly if the need arises.
Okay, so and your like a core element is really the analysis, right? It's not so much as a it's not should I say suggestion, right? So you're not suggesting anything, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can learn from yourself, right? We do kind of studies with people. We did a study with a paper earlier this year, and we found that of the articles that converted people from not a subscriber to a subscriber, in the articles they published over several months, more than half, more than 60%, were higher scoring articles. So if you're going for a subscription strategy, higher scoring articles may be something you want to put in front of people, especially if you think they're close to converting, so that you can have them see the value of your newspaper and do that. But yes, so the scores themselves don't say do this, do that. They're just saying, this is an apple, this is an orange.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then the more generic the model is, of course, the more interesting things you can do. You can use it to build a suggestion algorithm, but you can also use it to do a lot of other things. Okay. What is your maybe pricing and monetization strategy? So how obviously per API call I get something and so on and so forth, but still you should like attack bigger publishers, right? So what is your strategy there?
So definitely per API call is the way that we price everything, which means it's the same for everyone. We do have sort of a lower limit of the number of API calls per month, but then you can use those other API calls for anything else you want if you only have so many articles. Bigger publishers, again, with sort of lots of different pieces going on, tend to be quite useful for us in terms of a strategy. And then we've also received interest from the sort of media monitoring space, just because they obviously are also interested in news. That's the sort of the other side of it, is people who are writing being the publishers and the people who are reading being the more media monitoring analytics space. And so I imagine their number of API calls tends to be larger as well.
Okay, great. In terms of like how big is your team right now? How are you managing? Is it like a remote first company? What is the setup there?
It is, yeah. So I'm based in Brussels. I have two co-founders, Philip, who splits time between London and the south of France, and Reagan, who's based in New York for us, which is good for publishing as well. And so we're the three co-founders, and then we have our engineering team based in Portugal, and bringing on a new engineer there, as well as we have some sort of externs and interns who are around and help us out as well.
Wow. Okay.
So still sort of a small company, but excited to.
How do you manage this kind of distributed? I would imagine like even time zones alone could be a problem, right?
Yeah, I don't know if you know, but it was just sort of that 1 week of between when Europe does daylight savings and when North America does daylight savings.
Yeah.
Which, remember, I used to work for a newspaper and based in American newspaper from Brussels, and which meant my sort of schedule got all whacked out for a little while, but we just went through the same thing. So time zones are useful. Google Calendar does a good job of keeping up with it most of the time.
Okay.
But we like to have offsites and sort of get together as often as we can as well. So especially for things like conferences. We were all just in Spain for the One EFR conference and planning on meeting up again soon, probably in New York. So I think it's important to, especially when you're onboarding people, to have time. I mean, once you sort of establish a working relationship with people, it gets a little bit easier. But definitely, especially in the beginning, to have sort of, I'm not a fake person. I'm a real person who you just see mostly on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Are you guys mostly remote? Or
we are mostly remote, but even we have to have like those kinds of offsites and like regular offsites even help, because you think that once a year would be enough, but then you meet the team and just to convey like your new strategy, it is sometimes complicated if people are like we have like two employees that are in Asia right now, so doing their discovery and working and so on phase. And that is a challenge also, like the timelines and work and travel kind of thing. It is already interesting, but I think it is manageable, I think it is important also to kind of meet on a regular basis just to update. And sometimes there are things out there that you can see like in the corner of the eye of another person, and that just do not convey online. And it's very important. In terms of Maybe like the next steps. What are your plans like for the future, and
Yeah.
where the company is like in a couple of years? So are you raising? Are you trying to like bootstrap? What is the strategy?
Yeah. So we've been bootstrapped so far, but have got our first investor.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and we'll announce who they are when we do our seed round, but they're sort of the first investment into our seed round, which we're planning on raising at the beginning of next year,
Mm-hmm.
which is exciting. And so that raise is also going to come along with a new product, as I mentioned before, that more fine-grained insight into what articles are, in addition to sort of their levels of effort and things like that. So adding more choice, more definition, sort of more better data for our our clients in publishing. And then as people sort of take notice of us, I'd be interesting to see sort of how we can combine into other algorithms as well.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned sort of the Brussels DSA
Yeah.
and looking at algorithms, and that's what I'm just sort of fascinated being here in Brussels
Yeah.
and having something like Overtone that you can look at the sort of outputs that these models are making. And now with the DSA, they're going to have to allow that. Sort of the power given to auditors is going to be fairly strong. So that's something I'm working for with using Overtone in more sort of automated settings, I think will also
Mm-hmm.
be.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, and like a completely logical next step actually for the company to be offering these kind of more automation and kind of things. Yeah, that sounds very interesting, and I think the work that you guys are doing is so much fun. It is so much. And I think for your background, especially, I think it has this. I mean, for me, I'm a news junkie, right? But sometimes I'm just sometimes I like fail to consume as much as I used to but not because I don't want to read, but it just the way they present me the information is just not so appealing. And
Yeah.
as we inside of BotTalk as establishes, publishers need to kind of a little bit of help to win this battle for attention, because
Yeah.
when they're giving you this straight away linear here is our news,
Yeah.
and you need to read each article 2.5 minutes, and then I have Instagram on my phone. I mean, it
Yeah.
is impossible. They will
Yeah.
never win this over. Yeah.
It's just a it's just a differentiated experience. I think with again sitting on this gold mine of data that is the articles themselves and all of that, in addition to the relationship that publishers have to readers. I mean, readers trust publishers in a way that they don't really trust sort of ad tech companies, right?
Absolutely.
It's a different sort of ballgame. And so they have, I think, publishers now at this exact moment, like this
Mm.
exact moment when big tech is sort of figuring what it's going to do in our bright, beautiful, cookieless future, um, and and to build a different way of doing things.
Yeah.
Um, and that involves having a different tech stack that uses AI in a way that's sort of separate from the optimization that you see in big tech platforms. That was for me. You mentioned just sort of the experience of reading the news. That was for me what really sold me on this sort of this idea as a business. Because as much as it is for it's B2B right now, it's for publishers. Ultimately, it's a different experience for the reader. And I get my news now
Mm.
mostly via overtone scores, which is sort of I can choose what I want, which has made my
This is
cortisol
my
level
that was
drop by probably half.
this is my next question. Have you guys thought about like B2C applications?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would love to do that. I think the working with the publishers is important because they're the ones who already have those existing relationships to readers, and you want to prove sort of
Yeah.
that this works. But ultimately, when you look out into the future, um, with the way things are delivered by algorithms, I would like to have individual people, have more control over what they want to see in those editorial ways. So right now, again, hammers and nails. You can say, show me the most viewed article
Yeah.
today. Like well, great. What does that mean? That a bunch
Mhm.
of people read it? Fantastic. Like, show me a in-depth piece that's going to make me cry the second half of me reading it. Like, show me that. Show me all these sort of interesting ways that I can discover what I want to discover, without it being force-fed to me by an algorithm. And I think we're not super far off when people talk about um, a app store for social media algorithms
Yeah.
and things like that. I mean, this moves towards more user control, I think, is something that's going to gain steam and be a different way of doing things for B2C in the future.
Yeah, and that's definitely what the readers want. I mean, if you ask, like, of course, publishers, but if you ask like anyone in Germany, they have all, everyone, like from a general public, I would say, says only one thing. Okay, let us just read everything within one, like curated kind of app, and I will pay money, but I will
Yeah.
not pay for Süddeutsche, Frankfurter Allgemeine. So I will not pay 5 publishers at the same time, but can I have one? And it should be curated. And I think this is something that is still in the future. And I think things like your algorithm, or the way to structure, could really help. And it doesn't have to be your company that building it. It could be what I'm thinking is, like, it could be someone that says, we would really love to build like the app for the news. And
Yeah, and what you see is sort of news publishers um, combining together to work on some things as well for the ad market specifically.
yeah.
To say sort of this is what we're doing. I don't know if that's in the cards for
Mm-hmm.
sort of consumer facing
Mm-hmm.
product. It's funny, Reagan, you'll have to have Reagan on at some point. One of her first jobs was working with a consortium of newspapers and media outlets in the United States to try and all go online together.
Yeah.
This was in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't really work because there was too much competition between
Definitely.
them. Um, but I think in terms of providing good experiences to users, you can have the publishers do what they're doing and ultimately leave the curation a little bit up to people, but give them the tools they want. So if they don't want to see toxic things, then they can choose not to see toxic things. That will be great for them.
That is a great, great summary and the great last words for the podcast. Okay, on that note,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining. Thank you for opening up so much for the podcast. I really appreciate it. And yeah.